Ah, hello everybody. Welcome back to Bookcasting. As I've seen how many views my last podcast have been doing, I figured it'd be fun to try and do another talking about, the matter of something, I guess, if you will. That makes sense. And I figured since this is supposed to be a podcast about books, that would do, well, just that. I wanted to do a podcast about stories. Do stories matter? If so, why do they matter? Uh, and if you want a quick answer to that question, and you can bounce afterwards, the quick answer is that a story definitely matters. But why does it matter? It doesn't directly affect our lives in any way. It's just a pastime. It's just a form of entertainment, isn't it? It's a bit more than that. And I'm going to try to delve in and explain that as best I can. I figured I'd start out with this great little moment here, written by C.S. Lewis here. I am almost inclined to set it up as a canon that a children's story, which is enjoyed only by children, is a bad children's story. The good ones last. A waltz, which you can like only when you are waltzing, is a bad waltz. This canon seems to me most obviously true of that particular type of children's story which is dearest to my own taste, the fantasy or fairy tale. Now, the modern critical world uses adult as a term of approval. It is hostile to what is called nostalgia, and contemptuous of what it calls Peter Pantheism. Hence, a man who admits that dwarves and giants and talking beasts and witches are still dear to him in his 53rd years is now less likely to be praised for his perennial youth than scorned and pitied for arrested development. If I spend some little time defending myself against these charges, this is not so much because it matters greatly whether I am scorned and pitied, as because the defense is germane to my whole view of the fairy tale, and even literature in general. My defense consists of three propositions. I reply with the 2K. Critics who treat adult as a term of approval instead of a merely descriptive term cannot be adult themselves. To be concerned about being grown up, to admire the grown up because it is grown up, to blush at the suspension of being childish, these things are the marks of childhood and adolescence, and in childhood and adolescence they are in moderation healthy symptoms. Young things ought to want to grow, but to carry on into middle life or even into early manhood, this concern about being adult is a mark of really arrested development. When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret, and would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Now that I am 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness, and the desire to be very grown up. 2. The modern view seems to me involve a false conception of growth. They accuse us of arrested development because we have not lost a taste we had in childhood. But surely arrested development consists not in refusing to lose old things, but in failing to add new things. I now like hawk, which I am sure I should not have liked as a child, but I still like lemon squash. I call this growth or development because I have been enriched, where I formerly had only one pleasure. I now have two. But if I had to lose the taste for lemon squash because I acquired the taste for hawk, that would not be growth, but simple change. I now enjoy Tolstoy and Jane Austen and Trollope, as well as fairy tales, and I call that growth. If I had to lose the fairy tales in order to acquire the novelists, I would not say that I had grown, but only that I had changed. A tree grows because it adds rings. A train doesn't grow by leaving one station behind and puffing on to the next. In reality, the case is stronger and more complicated than this. I think my growth is just as apparent when I now read the fairy tales as when I read the novelists, for I now enjoy the fairy tales better than I did in childhood, being now able to put more in, of course. I get more out. But I do not here stress that point. Even if it were merely a taste for grown-up literature added to an unchanged taste for children's literature, addition would still be entitled to the name growth, and the process of merely dropping one parcel when you pick up another would not. It is, of course, true that the process of growing does intentionally and unfortunately involve some more losses, but that is not the essence of growth, certainly not what makes growth admirable or desirable. If to drop parcels and to leave stations behind were the essence and virtue of growth, why should we stop at adult? Why should not senile be equally a term of approval?
Why are we not to be congratulated on losing our teeth and hair? Some critics seem to confuse growth with the cost of growth, and also to wish to make that cost far higher than in nature it need be. The whole association of fairy tale and fantasy with childhood is local and accidental. I hope everyone has read Tolkien's essay on fairy tales, which is perhaps the most important contribution to the subject that anyone has yet made. If so, you will know already that in most places and times the fairy tale has not been specifically made for nor exclusively enjoyed by children. It has gravitated to the nursery when it became unfashionable in literary circles, just as unfashionable furniture gravitated to the nursery in Victorian houses. In fact, many children do not like this kind of book, just as many children do not like horsehair sofas, and many adults do like it, just as many adults like rocking chairs, and those who do like it, whether young or old, probably like it for the same reason. And none of us can say with any certainty what that reason is. The two theories which are the most often in mind are those of Tolkien and of Jung. According to Tolkien, on fairy stories, the appeal of the fairy story lies in the fact that man there must fully exercise his function as a sub-creator, not, as they love to say now, making a comment upon life, but making, so far as possible, a subordinate world of his own, since in Tolkien's view, this is one of man's proper functions. Delight naturally arises whenever it is successfully performed. For Jung, fairy tale liberates archetypes which dwell in the collective unconscious, and when we read a good fairy tale, we are obeying the old precept, know thyself. I would venture to add to this my own theory, not indeed of the kind as a whole, but of a feature in it. I mean the presence of being other than human, which yet behave in varying degrees humanly. The giants and dwarves and talking beasts. I believe these to be at least, for they have, as many other sources of power and beauty, an admirable hygriophilic which conveys psychology, types of characters more briefly than novelistic presentation. And to readers whom novelistic presentation could not yet reach, consider Mr. Badger in The Wind of Willows, the extraordinary amalgam of high rank, coarse manners, gruffness, shyness, and goodness. The child who has once met Mr. Badger has ever afterwards in his bones a knowledge of humanity and of English social history, which you could not get in any other way. Excuse me. So, I figured that would be a good place to start, considering it gives a good general idea of just how impactful stories are in a grand scheme of things, especially with fairy tales. As we all know, if we've ever, read any fairy tales, a lot of them do at least have some sort of, morals, if you will. I guess it depends on the fairy tale in which you read them. But the key point is, that I want to get to first and foremost, is that even if a story is a work of fiction, it's still true. And there's a reason that it's true. It comes to this: suspending our disbelief. Now, the reason we suspend our disbelief in a good story is because we can believe in what the story is talking about. So even if something fantastical happens, like the sky is falling, as nonsensical as that might be, if the story is good behind it, and there's a point to it, fictitious or otherwise, it can be believable, and people could believe in such things. This is why, a lot of the ancient myths and fairy tales would do outlandish things. Yeah, that it's just crazy to think. Like building, making a pair of wings and flying away in one of the great Greek myths. So, the suspension of one's disbelief is clearly important. And when a story is not believable, when a story is too fictitious to believe, people aren't going to buy it. So there's always an element of truth to that. And with truth also comes the other aspect as well, and that is, of course, lying. The best example of this is with the news. And this is a spinning one story. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So say a newspaper wrote some article about some crazy, a crazy shooter bursts into a principal's office and kills the principal, right? You want to automatically think, oh no, this is some horrible shooter person doing some horrible act, blah, blah, blah. But you don't get the full context of the story.
let's say the whole full context of the story was actually that the reason why this so-called lunatic shot the principal was because the principal basically groomed his own kid in the worst possible way and did other such nasty, gnarly things that, caused him to act in a way of vengeance. Not that that's necessarily right, mind you. To see how your perspective changed on the shooter after that, right? So, spinning a story can be used to great effect, and this can even work to even greater effects in the terms of propaganda. Now, propaganda you all know about today. Literally, you all know about propaganda. In the sense of a lot of the woke politics stuff. The Last Jedis and the Star Trek Picards and the shows that basically nobody wants. The lousy Little Mermaid remake, for God's sake. Everyone knows Ariel is a redhead. Everyone knows that. Yet they had to make her black. And then they're gonna do a Lilo and Stitch remake. and the actress that's playing the White Islander is apparently too white. Oh, the irony. But I don't want to get into the whole race hustling bullshit. All I'm stating is that a lot of that crap is bullshit, and you know it's bullshit because it's blatant propaganda. It's, as the definition, it's information, especially of a biased and misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or viewpoint. So you're probably wondering, what am I trying to get across with this whole thing? That's a good question. Well, the answer is simple. The reason stories matter, all stories matter, is, even if it is fictitious, even if it's fantastical, is because of this. Stories will inevitably give us our perceptions of the world around us. It may not directly influence our day-to-day lives, but it does influence our perceptions of the world we see and live in. So, for example, if you watch a bunch of stories, films, what have you, read books, that's about a bunch of nefarious, gnarly, nasty, manipulative, psychologically abusive assholes that are obsessed with power and killing everyone all the time, you'll eventually think that most people are like that. Whereas if you had a story where you had really sound people of sound mind that were kind and caring and even heroic, you would actually perceive that more people are kind and human and heroic. There's a lot of a lot of how we view the world around us is through the stories that are told to us, and the stories that we, if you like, for a better word, we consume. It's not that these stories enforce us to believe in this. It's rather that stories can persuade us better than anything else to a particular viewpoint or perception that we wouldn't otherwise agree to. And this is really the meat of what makes stories matter. It's not just that it's entertainment. It's that it can change how we perceive the world around us. That's the thing right there. How we perceive the world is defined by the stories told to us and which stories we actually take heed to. The stories that we listen to. And I think that's the very thing that most people don't take into account. I honestly fear sometimes that people just sort of consume stories without any afterthought of what type of stories they're actually reading or thinking about. Yeah, you can even see this in the context of many reviews, as people in a review will more likely summarize what they've read or watched than actually review what they read or watched in a more literal sense. So yeah, this is really the impactfulness of storytelling, and this is why its misuses, especially in terms of things like propaganda, is very, very dangerous. And this is why states would try and use this. Oh, here. We got Wikipedia on propaganda. Let's look at that real quick. Propaganda is communication that is primarily used to influence and persuade an audience for their agenda. In the 20th century, the English term propaganda was often associated with a manipulative approach, but historically, propaganda has been a neutral descriptive term of any material that promotes certain opinions or ideologies. Equivalent non-English terms have also largely retained the original neutral connotation. A wide range of materials and media are used for conveying propaganda messages, which changed as new technologies were invented, including paintings, cartoons, posters, pamphlets, films, radio shows, TV shows, and websites. More recently, the digital age has given rise to new ways of disseminating propaganda. For example, bots and algorithms are currently being used to create computational propaganda or fake or biased news and spread it on social media. Yeah, it's no different than the back in the old days of classic spinning of news stories that they would used to do, ironically. Etymology. Propaganda is a modern Latin word, the neuter plural gerundive form of propagare, meaning to spread or to propagate. Thus, propaganda means the things which are to be propagated. Originally, this word derived from a new administrative body of the Catholic Church created in 1622 as part of the Counter-Reformation, called the Congregation for Propagating the Faith, or informally simply propaganda. Its activities was aimed at propagating Catholic faith in non-Catholic countries. Now, before I move on, I just want to make this point. I know a lot of people like to point out how ridiculous, the church controlling the arts and blah blah blah, and I can understand where people are coming through on that end. I just want to make the point that literally nothing has changed with this, other than who's doing it now. This is basically done by the state nowadays instead of the church. That's the only thing that's changed. The act of doing this sort of thing hasn't changed. It's just the people that are doing it that's different. But they're still doing the same thing. So I fail to see why people get happy about the church not being able to do this, only to have it handed over to someone else instead of just trying to stop doing that. Yeah. Propaganda was conceptualized as a form of influence designed to build social consensus. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. In the 20th century, the term propaganda emerged along with the rise of mass media, including newspapers and radio. As researchers began studying the effects of media, they used suggestion theory to explain how people could be influenced by emotionally resonant, persuasive messages. Harold Laswell provided a broad definition of the term propaganda, writing it as the expression of opinions or actions carried out deliberately by individuals or groups with a view to influence the opinions or actions of other individuals or groups for the predetermined ends and through psychological manipulations. Garth Jowett and Victoria O'Donnell theorized that propaganda and persuasion are linked as humans use communication as a form of soft power through the development and cultivation of propaganda materials. In a 1929 literary debate with Edward Bernays, Everett D. Martin argues that propaganda is making puppets of us. We are moved by hidden strings which the propagandist manipulates. In the 1920s and 30s, propaganda was sometimes described as all-powerful. For example, Bernays acknowledged in his book Propaganda that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate the unseen mechanism of society constitute the invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our taste formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. History. Primitive forms of propaganda have been a human activity as far back as reliable recorded evidence exists. The Behistunic inscription detailing the rise of Darius I to the Persian throne is viewed by most historians as an early example of propaganda. Another striking example of propaganda during ancient history is the last Roman civil wars, during which Octavian and Mark Antony blamed each other for obscure and degrading origins, cruelty, cowardice, oratorial and literary incompetence, debaucheries, luxury, drunkenness, and other slanders. This defamation took the form of I cannot pronounce that. Roman rhetorical gene of the invective, which was decisive for shaping the Roman public opinion at this time. Another early example of propaganda was from Genghis Khan. The emperor would send some of his men ahead of his army to spread rumors to the enemy. In many cases, his army was actually smaller than his opponents. Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I was the first ruler to utilize the power of the printing press for propaganda in order to build his image, stir up patriotic feelings in the population of his empire. He was the first ruler who utilized one-sided battle reports, the early predecessors of modern newspapers, or I can't pronounce that, targeting the masses, and influenced the population of his enemies. Propaganda during the Reformation, helped by the spread of the printing press throughout Europe and in particular with Germany, caused new ideas, thoughts, and doctrine to be made available to the public in ways that had not been seen before the 16th century. During the era of the American Revolution, the American colonies had a flourishing network of newspapers and printers who specialized in the topic on behalf of the patriots, and to a lesser extent on behalf of the loyalists. Academic Barbara Diggs-Brown conceives that the negative connotations of the term propaganda are associated with the earlier social and political transformations that occurred during the French Revolutionary period movement of 1789 to 1799. Between the start and the middle portion of the 19th century, in a time where the word started to be used in a non-clerical and political context, the first large-scale and organized propagation of government propaganda was occasioned by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. After the defeat of Germany, military officials such as General Erich Ludendorff suggested the British propaganda had been instrumental in their defeat. Adolf Hitler came to echo this view, believing that it had been a primary cause of the collapse of morale and revolts in the German home front and navy in 1918. In Mein Kampf, Hitler expounded his theory of propaganda, which provided a powerful base for the rise to power in 1933. Historian Robert Enser explains that Hitler puts no limit on what can be done by propaganda. People will believe anything, provided they are told it often enough and empathetically enough, and that contradictors are either silenced or smothered in calumny. This was to be true in Germany and backed up with their army, making it difficult to allow other propaganda to flow in. Most propaganda in Nazi Germany was produced by the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels mentions propaganda as a way to see through the masses. Symbols are used towards propaganda such as justice, liberty, and one's devotion to one's country. World War II saw continued use of propaganda as a weapon of war, building on the experience of World War I by Goebbels and the British Political Warfare Executive, as well as the United States Office of War Information. In the early 20th century, the invention of motion pictures, as in movies, diaphragms, gave propaganda creators a powerful tool for advancing political and military interests when it came to reaching a broad segment of the population and creating consent or encouraging rejection of the real or imagined enemy. In the years following the October Revolution in 1917, the Soviet government sponsored the Russian film industry with the purpose of making propaganda films. The 1925 film The Battleship Potemkin glorifies communist ideals. In World War II, Nazi filmmakers produced highly emotional films to create popular support for occupying the Sudetenland and attack Poland. The 1930s and 1940s, which saw the rise of totalitarian states and the Second World War, arguably the golden age of propaganda. Yeah, we'll see about that. Leni Riefenstahl, a filmmaker worked in Nazi Germany, created one of the best-known propaganda movies, Triumph of the Will. In 1942, the propaganda song Niet Nuoto was made in Finland during the Continuation War, making fun of the Red Army's failure in the Winter War, referring to the song's name to the Soviet's Minister of Foreign Affairs. I cannot pronounce that. In the U.S., animation became popular, especially for winning over youthful audiences and aiding the U.S. war effort, e.g. Der Führer's Face, which ridicules Hitler and advocates the value of freedom. Some Americans' war films in the early 1940s were designed to create a patriotic mindset and convince viewers that sacrifices needed to be made to defeat the Axis powers. Others were intended to help Americans understand their allies in general, as in films like Know Your Ally, Britain, and Our Greek Allies. Apart from its war films, Hollywood did its part to boost American morale in a film intended to show how stars of stage and screen who remained on the home front were doing their part not just in their labors, but also in their understanding that a variety of peoples worked together against the Axis menace. Stage Door Canteen features one segment meant to dispel Americans' mistrust of the Soviets, and another to dispel the bigotry against the Chinese. Polish filmmakers in Great Britain created anti-Nazi color film Calling Mr. Smith about Nazi crimes in German-occupied Europe, and about lies in the Nazi propaganda. The West and the Soviet Union both used propaganda extensively during the Cold War. Both sides used film, television, and radio programming to influence their own citizens, each other, and the Third World nations through a front organization called the Bedford Publishing Company. The CIA through a covert department called the Office of Policy Coordination disseminated over 1 million books to Soviet readers over the span of 15 years, including novels by George Orwell, Albert Camus, Baltimore, I cannot pronounce that, James Joyce, and Pat Pasher. Some of these names, man. In an attempt to promote anti-communist sentiment and sympathy of Western values. George Orwell's contemporaneous novels Animal Farm and 1984 portrayed the use of propaganda in fictional dystopian societies. During the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro stressed the importance of propaganda. Propaganda was used extensively by the communist forces in the Vietnam War as a means of controlling people's opinions. During the Yugoslav Wars, propaganda was used as a military strategy by governments of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and Croatia. Propaganda was used to create fear and hatred, and particularly to incite the Serb population against the other ethnicities, Bosniaks, Croats, and Albians, and other non-Serbs. Serb media made a great effort in justifying, revising, or denying mass war crimes committed by the Serb forces during these wars. Public perceptions. In the early 20th century, the term propaganda was used by the founders of the nascent public relations industry to refer to the people, literally translated from the Latin gurnine, as things that must be disseminated. In some cultures, the term is neutral or even positive, while in others the term has acquired a strong negative connotation. The connotation of the term propaganda can also vary over time. For example, in Portuguese and some Spanish language-speaking countries, particularly in the Southern Cone, the word propaganda usually refers to the most common manipulated media, advertising. In English, propaganda was originally a neutral term for dissemination of information in favor of any given cause. During the 20th century, however, the term acquired a thoroughly negative meaning in Western countries, representing the intentional dissemination of often false but certainly compelling claims to support or justify political actions or ideologies, according to Harold Laswell. The term began to fall out of favor due to the growing public suspicion of propaganda in the wake of its use during World War I by Creel Committee in the United States and the Ministry of Information in Britain. Writing in 1928, Laswell observed, "In democratic countries, the official propaganda bureau was looked upon with genuine alarm for fear that it might be suborned to party and personal ends. The outcry in the United States against Mr. Creel's alarm for fear that it might be suborned to... The outcry in the United States against Mr. Creel's famous Bureau of Public Information or Inflammation helped to din into the public mind the fact that propaganda existed. The public's discovery of propaganda has led to a great lamentation over it. Propaganda has become an epitaph of contempt and hate, and the propagandists have sought protective coloration in such names as Public Relation Council, Specialist in Public Education, Public Relation Advisor." In 1949, political science professor Dayton David McKean wrote, "After World War I, the word came to be applied to what you don't like of other fellows' publicity, as Edward L. Bernays said, contestation. The term is essentially contested, and some have argued for neutral... Okay, we're going to skip that one. Types. Identifying propaganda has always been a problem. The main difficulties have involved differentiating propaganda from other types of persuasion and avoiding biased approach. Richard Allen Nielsen provided a definition of the term. Propaganda is neutrally defined as a systematic form of purposeful persuasion that attempts to influence the emotions, attitudes, opinions, and actions of specified target audiences for ideological, political, or commercial purposes through controlled transmission of one-sided messages which may or may not be factual via mass and direct media channels. The definition focuses on the communicative process involved, or more precisely on the purpose of the process, and allow propaganda to be interpreted as a positive or negative behavior depending on the perspective of the viewer or listener. Propaganda can often be recognized by rhetorical strategies used in its design. In the 1930s, the Institute for Propaganda Analysis identified a variety of propaganda techniques that were commonly used in newspapers and on radio, which were the mass media of the time. Propaganda techniques include name-calling, using derogatory labels, bandwagon, expressing the social appeal of a message, or glittering generalities, using positive but imprecise language. With the rise of the internet and social media,
Rennie Hobbs identified 4 characteristic design features of many forms of contemporary propaganda. 1. It activates strong emotions. 2. It simplifies information. 3. It appeals to the hopes, fears, and dreams of a targeted audience. And 4. It attacks opponents. Propaganda is sometimes evaluated based on the attention and goals of the individual or institution who created it. According to historian, I cannot pronounce your name, propaganda is defined as either white, gray, or black. White propaganda openly discloses its sources and intent. Gray propaganda has an ambiguous or non-disclosed source or intent. Black propaganda purports to be published by the enemy or some organization beside its actual origins. Compare with black operation, a type of clandestine operation in which the identity of the sponsoring government is hidden. In scale, these different types of propaganda can also be defined by the potential of true and correct information to compete with the propaganda. For example, opposition to white propaganda is often readily found and may slightly discredit the propaganda source. Opposition to gray propaganda, when revealed, often by the inside source, may create some level of public outcry. Opposition to black propaganda is often unavailable and may be dangerous to reveal, because public consigns of black propaganda tactics and sources would undermine or backfire the very campaign the black propagandists supported. The propagandist seeks to change the way people understand an issue or situation for the purpose of changing their actions and expectations in ways that are desirable to the interest group. Propaganda, in this sense, serves as a corollary to censorship, in which the same purpose is achieved, not by filling people's minds with approved information, but by preventing people from being confronted with opposing points of view. What sets propaganda apart from other forms of advocacy is a willingness of the propagandists to change people's understanding through deception and confusion rather than persuasion and understanding. The leaders of an organization know the information to be one-sided or untrue, but this may be true for the rank and file members who help disseminate the propaganda. Okay. Whew. Oh, look at that. Advertising politics. Propaganda shares techniques with advertising and public relations, each of which can be thought of propaganda that promotes a commercial product or shapes the perception of an organization, person, or brand. For example, after claiming victory in 2006 Lebanon War, Hezbollah campaigned for broader popularity among Arabs by organizing mass rallies where Hezbollah leader I can't pronounce that combined elements of local dialect with classical Arabic to reach audiences outside Lebanon. Banners and billboards were commissioned in commemoration of the war, along with various merchandise items with Hezbollah's logo, flag color, and images of Nazi t-shirts, baseball caps, and other war memorabilia were marketed for all ages. The uniformity of messaging helped define Hezbollah's brand. Journalistic theory generally holds that news items should be objective, giving the reader an accurate background and analysis of the subject on hand. On the other hand, advertisements evolved from traditional commercial advertisements to include also a new type in the form of paid articles or broadcasts disguised as news. These generally present an issue in a very subjective and often misleading light, primarily meant to persuade rather than inform. Normally, they use only subtle propaganda techniques and not the more obvious ones used in traditional commercial advertisements. If the readers believes that a paid advertisement is a fact, a news item, the message the advertiser is trying to communicate will be more easily believed or internalized. Such appearance of propaganda, which is misleading, federal law specifically mandates that any advertisement appearing in the format of the news item must state that the item is in fact a paid advertisement. Edmund McGarry illustrates that advertising is more than selling to an audience, but a type of propaganda that is trying to persuade the public and not to be balanced in judgment. And here's one with politics. Propaganda has become more common in political contexts, in particular, to refer to certain efforts sponsored by the governments, political groups, but also often covert interests. In the early 20th century, propaganda was exemplified in the form of party slogans. Propaganda also has much in common with public information campaigns by governments, which are intended to encourage or discourage certain forms of behavior, such as wearing seatbelts, not smoking, littering, and so forth. Again, the emphasis is more political in propaganda. Propaganda can take form of leaflets, posters, TV, radio broadcasts, and can also extend to any other medium. In case of the United States, there is also important legal imposed by law distinction between advertising, a type of overt propaganda, and what the Government Accountability Office, an arm of the United States Congress, refers to covert propaganda. Roderick Hindery argues that propaganda exists in the political left and right and in mainstream centralist parties. Hindery further argues that the debates are about most social issues can be productively revisited in the context of asking what is or is not propaganda. Not to be overlooked is the link between propaganda, indoctrination, and terrorism, counterterrorism. He argues that threats to destroy are often as socially disruptive as physical devastation itself. Since 9/11 and the appearance of greater media fluidity, propaganda institutions, practices, and legal frameworks have been evolving in the U.S. and Britain. Bryant shows how this included expansion and integration of the apparatus cross-government and details attempts to coordinate the forms of propaganda for foreign and domestic audiences with new efforts in strategic communication. These were subject to contestation within the U.S. government, resisted by Pentagon Public Affairs, and critiqued by some scholars. The National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2013 amended the U.S. Information and Educational Exchange Act of 1948, popularly referred to as the Smith-Mudd Act, and the Foreign Relations Authorization Act 1987, allowing the materials produced by the State Department and Broadcasting Board of Governors to be released with the U.S. borders for the archivists of the United States. The Smith-Mudd Act, as amended, provided that the Secretary and Broadcasting Board of Governors shall make available the archivists of the United States for domestic distribution, motion pictures, films, videotapes, and other materials 12 years after the initial dissemination of the material abroad. Nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit the Department of the State Broadcasting Board of Governors from engaging in that. Okay. In the wake of this, the internet has become a prolific method of distributing political propaganda, benefiting from an evolution in coding called bots. Software agents or bots can be used for many things, including populating social media with automated messages and posts with a range of sophistication. During the 2016 U.S. election, a cyber strategy was implemented using bots to direct U.S. voters to Russian political news and information sources and spread political. Okay. Techniques. Common media for transmitting propaganda messages include news reports, government reports, historical revision, junk science, books, leaflets, movies, radio, television, posters. Some propaganda campaigns follow a strategic transmission pattern to indoctrinate the target group. This may begin with a simple transmission, such as leaflet or advertisements dropped from a plane or an advertisement. Generally, these messages will contain directions on how to obtain more information via website, hotline, radio program, as it is seen also for selling purposes among other goals. The strategy intends to initiate the individual from information to recipient to information seeker through reinforcement, and then from information seeker to opinion leader through indoctrination. A number of techniques based in social psychology research are used to generate propaganda. Many of these same techniques can be found under logical fallacies, since propagandists use arguments that, while sometimes convincing, are not necessarily valid. Some time has been spent analyzing the means by which the propaganda messages are transmitted. That work is important, but it is clear that information dissemination strategies become propaganda strategies only when coupled with propagandist messages. Identifying these messages is necessary prerequisite to study methods by which those messages are spread. Propaganda can also be turned on its makers. For example, postage stamps have frequently been tools for government advertising, such as North Korea's extensive issues. The presence of Stalin's on numerous Soviet stamps is another example. In Nazi Germany, Hitler frequently appeared on postage stamps in Germany and some of the occupied nations. A British program to parody these and other Nazi-inspired stamps involved airdroppings then into Germany on letters containing anti-Nazi literature. In 2018, a scandal broke in which journalist several whistleblowers and the academic Dr. Emma Bryant revealed advances in digital propaganda techniques showing that online human intelligence techniques used in psychological warfare has been coupled with psychological profiling using illegally obtained social media data for political campaigns in the United States 2000. Okay, but later admitted breaking UK law. Persuasion and social psychology. The field of social psychology includes the study of persuasion. Social psychologists can be sociologists or psychologists. The field includes many theories and approaches to understanding persuasion. For example, communication theory points out that people can be persuaded by the communicator's credibility, expertise, trustworthiness, and attractiveness. The elaboration likelihood model, as well as the heuristic model of persuasion, suggest that a number of factors, the degree of interest of the recipient of the communication, influence the degree to which people allow superficial factors to persuade them. Nobel Prize winning psychologist Herbert A. Simon won the Nobel Prize for his theory that people are cognitive misers. That is, in a society of mass information, people are forced to make decisions quickly and often superficially as opposed to logically. According to William W. Biddy's 1931 article, A Psychological Definition of Propaganda, the four principles followed in propaganda are: rely on emotions, never argue, cast propaganda into the pattern of we versus an enemy, reach groups as well as individuals, hide the propagandists as much as possible. More recently, studies from behavioral science have become significant in understanding and planning propaganda campaigns. These include, for example, nudge theory, which was used by the Obama campaign in 2008 and adapted by the UK government behavioral insights team. Behavioral methodologies that became subject to great controversy in 2000. Kind of keep bringing that up, don't you? Halfing Hong argues that propaganda is not always necessary about convincing a populace of its messages. It may actually fail to do this, but instead can also function as a means of intimidating the citizenry and signaling the regime's strength and ability to maintain its control and power over society. By investing significant resources into propaganda, the regime can forewarn its citizens of its strength and deterring them from attempting to challenge it. Propaganda theory and education. During the 1930s, educators in the United States and around the world became concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism and other forms of violent extremism. The Institute for Propaganda Analysis was formed to introduce methods of instruction for high school and college students, helping learners to recognize and desist propaganda by identifying persuasive techniques. This work built upon classical rhetoric, and it was informed by suggestive theory and social scientific studies of propaganda and persuasion. In the 50s, propaganda theory and education examined the rise of American consumer culture, and this work was popularized by Vance Packard in the 1957 book The Hidden Persuaders. European theologian Jacques Ellul's landmark work, Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes, framed propaganda in relation to larger themes about the relationship between humans and technology. Media messages did not serve to enlighten or inspire, he argued. They merely overwhelmed by arousing emotions and oversimplifying ideas, limiting human reasoning and judgment. In the 1980s, academics recognized the news and journalism could function as propaganda when business and government interests were amplified by mass media. The propaganda model is a theory advanced by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky, which argues systematic biases exist in mass media that are shaped by structural economic causes. It argues that the way in which commercial media institutions are structured and operate through advertising revenue, concentration of media ownership, or access sources create an inherent conflict of interest that makes them act as propaganda for powerful political commercial interests. The 20th century has been characterized by three developments of great political importance: the growth of democracy, the growth of corporate power, and the growth of corporate propaganda as a means of protecting corporate power against democracy. Unless, of course, the corporate power is the corporate democracy. Anyways, first presented in their book Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, the propaganda model analysis is commercial mass media as businesses that sell a product, access to readers and audiences, to other businesses, advertisers, and that benefit from access to information from government and corporate sources to produce their content. The theory postulates 5 general classes of filters that shape the content that is presented in news media: ownership of the medium, reliance on advertising and revenue, access to news sources, threat of litigation and commercial backlash, and anti-communism and fear ideology. The first 3, ownership, funding, and sourcing, are generally regarded by the authors as being the most important. Although the model was based mainly on the characterization of the United States media, Chomsky and Herman believe the theory is equally applicable to any other country that shares the basic political economic structure and model that's subsequently been applied by the other scholars to study media biases in other countries. By the 1900s, the topic of propaganda was no longer a part of public education, having been relegated to a specialist subject. Secondary English educators grew fearful of the study of propaganda genres, choosing to focus on argumentation and reasoning instead of the highly emotional forms of propaganda found in advertising political campaigns. In 2015, the European Commission funded Mind Over Media, a digital learning platform for teaching and learning about contemporary propaganda. The study of contemporary propaganda is growing in secondary education, where it is seen as part of language arts and social studies. Okay. Damn. Oh, damn. Modern propaganda. The modern propaganda model is a framework introduced in 2016 by Jacob M. Dillum, a data scientist who identified political botnets, primarily on Twitter, used to censor public speech and sway voter outcomes in the U.S. elections. The model presented in the book Modern Propaganda explores the manipulation of digital communication to influence individual society and news media. The book also delves into the interpretation and manipulation of data analytics and patterns to shape news stories. The modern propaganda model suggests that propaganda techniques such as use of bots, targeted messaging, and data manipulation can be used to control the public discourse and sway political outcomes. The model argues that modern technology has created new opportunities for propaganda and manipulation, and that these techniques are increasingly used in political campaigns and other forms of communication. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Sorry I read all that. I wasn't expecting to read that, but here we are. The reason why I focus on propaganda so much is because propaganda proves my point in terms of, how stories can shape our viewpoint in life and what we choose to live our lives by, basically. If stories did not matter, governments would not be tirelessly trying to find new ways of controlling the media and thereby the message that is being conveyed through it. So keep that in mind. So yes, stories fucking matter. And you better be watching out what stories you're actually consuming. Because you never know. You may be being misled. Yeah, and that's going to do it for today. So, later.